is absolute.
Hello everyone and welcome back to the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. Hope you guys are enjoying the show this far. This should be another fantastic segment for a guy who I'm looking for a huge second season out of, on a new look defense that's continuing to add more pieces in this very friendly window for this specific team. This guy certainly feels like one of the new and exciting faces to deliver this defense into the superstardom I believe it deserves. And that player is Will Anderson. The Texans defense definitely was one of the biggest surprises of last year, combining a solid defensive front with a astonishingly, fascinatingly unexpected secondary. But the main center of attention was always going to be Will Anderson. Perhaps the best defensive prospect out of that 2023 NFL draft class, mainly because of his versatility, his skill set, and most importantly, what the Texans saw in him in his terms of ability to improve himself. However, I feel like in this window, as the Houston Texans realize that they really have a structure to build around here, these new pieces could see Will Anderson potentially lose some of the production that he could be known for. And so without further ado, let's jump into his fascinating last season and see if he can translate it in a revitalized, new-look Texans defense. Last year, he had an 88.8 fantasy points, 7 sacks, 22 QB hits, solid season. One thing of note is that in terms of pass rush win rate, he had a 23.8% pass rush win state. And it just goes to show this kid has instinctual traits that can't be taught, and his motor is very high. He's always looking to move in terms of that pass rush. Very fantastic in terms of his use of moves. And in a defense that definitely relied on him more often than not to generate pressure, I feel like that was a solid start to his NFL career. Now here comes the caveats in many different forms. The Houston Texans, because of last season, kind of are in win now mode. And even though the defense was certainly one of the more shocking surprises for this team, they feel that they want to add a little bit more juice and oomph to this defensive front. And so they perhaps had one of the biggest off seasons in terms of additions to their defense of any team in the NFL. And that all started when they acquired Danielle Hunter. Well, Danielle Hunter is certainly a weird guy because you don't often think of him as someone who dominates the stats, but he dominates in different ways. He eats blockers and he opens up space. And he can also generate the occasional pressure. And so, even though he's kind of in the older spectrum of things, he still is someone who can complement Will Anderson well. But I don't think he's necessarily the problem, because at the end of the day, they're two edge rushers trying to create their own pressure, and whoever gets to the quarterback first, I guess, is the one who's going to get the most stats. So they're just going to have to fight it out for who gets the most stats. That's not my concern. My concern is on the interior and how that will affect Will Anderson's movement a little bit. You had Foley Fatukasi already, but then you signed a guy in Nico Autry, who's one of the more underrated defensive tackles in the league. Out of Tennessee, I really like his profile as this guy who can also generate his own pressure, can create space, and I think that while all of these moves certainly can open up new avenues for Will Anderson, I think this can also inhibit him a little bit. Because when you think about it, I really think that what the Texans see in their defense is kind of this chasm between the front and the secondary. The secondary was also one of the shocking surprises of the season. And when you have this weird contrast where the middle ground, the linebacker spot, is one of the weaker spots in your team, and you bring in these interior defensive linemen who want to open this up, how is Will Anderson going to be deployed? Because we can talk about his instinct and motor all we want, but his most important asset is his versatility. Not only can he play as an edge rusher, but he can play as a linebacker. But if you're putting him into that weaker core, there feels like there could be more of a chance that some of his best traits might be hidden. And so, if there becomes kind of this rift change or sea change in how the Texans feel like Will Anderson should be deployed, I feel like a lot of what makes Will Anderson so important to this defense could be lost a little bit. And so, I really think that the focus should be on sustaining your two ends and making sure that Hunter really complements and brings out the best of Will Anderson, and not necessarily inhibiting some of the skills that Will Anderson has, because he definitely is versatile, but in certain areas I feel like he can be deployed in many different ways, and I don't want him to get caught up in how Will Anderson plays the game, because I really think focusing on that front four especially is highly integral to the Texans' success as a defense. That's where all your pressure is coming from. That's where all your players should be at the same level. They all should have this intensity and physicality to their play. And Will Anderson should be the guy to kind of lead this revitalized defensive front to the promised land. But when you add so many pieces to a team that certainly feels like its identity is already set, especially when you have such a very, very important defensive piece who's so young, definitely feels a little weird as to how the dynamic's going to pan out. Also, like I said, the secondary comes into play a lot here. I feel like if you're an opposing offense and you're diagnosing the Texans, I feel like you can get a lot of quick passes here. If you stay focused on working the middle of the field, kind of occupying the linebackers, kind of manipulating the front a little bit, then you might have a little bit of success. So that factors into how the Texans might use Will Anderson. If they feel like a lot more teams are passing on them, he might have to go back to the linebacker position, because ultimately he is their best quote-unquote linebacker, actually, if he plays there. However, he's not the best coverage man, which takes away his ability to blitz. This is a conundrum, keeps on going in the cycle, where Will Anderson Jr. definitely has this feeling of being one of these players who might just be too good at one thing to really kind of be able for his versatility to show. And I think that opposing offenses now more than ever have the opportunity to exploit that in so many different ways. Not just because of who they added, but because of them knowing that Will Anderson, at the end of the day, is going to want to get to your quarterback. And if your quarterback's a quick processor, quick in terms of timing, then you can use that to your advantage. Because that's one less player you have to worry about as a linebacker, and one less player who you know is not going to cover man. And so that's a huge caveat for Will Anderson to have, for a player of his ability to have. But at the end of the day, if the Texans stick with this idea of complementary football, the fact that Danielle Hunter really is just going to build upon the foundation of what Will Anderson has set for the standard of this Texans defense, especially up front, and if Fatukasi and Autry can penetrate from the interior to kind of allow Will Anderson more freedom, then this whole project can work. And I really want it to work because Will Anderson, when all is said and done, could be one of the better players from this 23 draft class. The better defensive players especially. And the bottom line for this defense needs to be Will Anderson at its center. Because you can add more pieces. I completely get it as this team that wants to build for success. But it's all going to come from how you use Will Anderson. If he gets kind of cast away a little bit, or if he's bolstered by these new signings. And that will define the Houston Texans in this era. That will just about do it for the segment of today's show. Coming up next week, transition from kind of the front to the secondary. We talk about someone that ESPN recently ranked number 1 in terms of their number 1 cornerbacks. Figure out who it is after the break on the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast.